I was 26 years old when I heard the voice of a man I had been told to obey for my whole life telling me, over a small radio in a barracks corridor near Bordeaux, that France was finished and the soldiers should stop fighting. It was 12:30 in the afternoon, the 17th of June 1940. Marshal Pétain, the hero of Verdun. The voice was old and slow and very tired. I remember a fly on the windowsill. I remember the corporal beside me starting to cry. And I remember thinking, very clearly, the way you think only once or twice in a life, no, I will not. You have to understand the speed of it. On the 10th of May, the German army crossed into Belgium and the Netherlands. 4 days later, panzers were across the Meuse at Sedan. By the end of May, the British Expeditionary Force was being lifted off the beach at Dunkirk. The French First Army fought to cover them and was destroyed doing it. By the 10th of June, the government had abandoned Paris. The roads south were a single column of carts and bicycles and women carrying mattresses and children carrying birdcages. The Wehrmacht entered Paris on the 14th, an open city, no shot fired in the streets. 3 days later Pétain was premier, and 3 days after that the radio spoke. 6 weeks, that was all it took. France lost roughly 85,000 soldiers killed, and another 200,000 wounded and 1.5 million taken prisoner. We had not collapsed without fighting. We had fought and we had been broken. There is a difference, and the difference matters. But by the 17th of June, the army I belonged to was being told over the radio by a marshal of France to stop, and the armistice was not yet signed. It would be signed 5 days later in a railway carriage in the forest of Campigny, on the same spot in the same carriage where Germany had signed in November of 1918. They wanted us to feel the symmetry. We felt it. The barracks where I was posted held about 80 men, most of them reservists from the southwest, farmers and millers and a schoolteacher from the Dordogne. Our colonel was a man I will not name because his daughter is still alive and she is a kind woman. He had served in the RIF in the 20s, and he loved the army the way some men love a cathedral. He gathered us in the courtyard the afternoon of the 17th and read the broadcast aloud slowly so we could understand. Then he said, "We will await orders." That is all he said. Then he went into his office and closed the door, and we did not see him again that day. The men talked in small groups by the wall. The schoolteacher wept openly and said it was a relief. The miller said nothing. A young lieutenant from Toulouse, 23 years old, sat with his back against the wall and stared at his boots for an hour without moving. I walked outside the courtyard into the lane where the cherry trees were heavy with fruit nobody had picked. I stood there for a long time. I tried to think practically. The armistice would come in days. The army would be demobilized. The northern half of France would be occupied. The southern half would be governed by Pétain from somewhere, Vichy as it turned out, though I did not know that yet. The empire would go where Pétain pointed. The fleet at Toulon would do what Pétain told it to do. And every officer in this barracks would be asked, very politely, to swear an oath of personal loyalty to a man who was about to hand the country to its enemy. I went back inside and I found the lieutenant from Toulouse. I said very quietly, "Are you going home?" He did not look up. He said, "I have no home north of the Loire anymore." And then after a moment, "Why?" I said, "Because I am going south, to the hills. I am not signing anything." He looked up at me then for the first time, and he said, "Tomorrow night I will come." That was the first conversation. There would be others in other barracks, in cafes, in the back rooms of pharmacies, in country churches at Mass when the priest spoke a sermon about St. Joan that meant something other than what the verger thought it meant. The conversation moved like a small fish under shallow water. It was easy to miss if you were not looking. It was impossible to miss if you were. And then the order came. It was the evening of the 23rd of June, the day after the armistice was signed. A staff captain arrived in a dusty Citroën from regional headquarters with a satchel of papers, and we were each summoned one by one into the colonel's office. The desk was bare except for a sheet of typed paper and a fountain pen. The captain was polite. He explained that as officers we were to acknowledge in writing our acceptance of the armistice and our pledge to serve the French state under the Marshal. I took the pen. I held it for what must have been 4 or 5 seconds. The captain watched me without expression. Then I put the pen down on the desk very carefully and I said, "I cannot." He blinked. "You cannot what, Lieutenant?" I said, "I cannot sign this. I do not recognize the legitimacy of the act of the 22nd of June. That was all I said. I had rehearsed nothing. The words came out of my mouth like stones that had been waiting in my chest for years. He looked at me for a long time. He was perhaps 50. He had a small scar on his lower lip from a wound. Then he said very quietly, "Lieutenant, if you walk out of this office without signing, I will have to record it. Do you understand what that means?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Then go quickly, before I record it," and he turned the paper over on his desk so that I would not be the next entry on it. That night I packed a small bag. I left the barracks before dawn through the kitchen door. I walked 7 kilometers along a field path to the railway halt at La Roche-de-Beaune. I had 400 francs in my boot. The lieutenant from Toulouse was waiting at the halt with a canvas pack and a pair of his father's hunting boots. We took a southbound train. We were 2 of perhaps 100 men in France that night who did the same thing in different barracks in different ways. The official record does not contain our names. The men who stayed were not, most of them, traitors. They were tired. They had a wife and a child and a small farm and a marshal of France telling them on the radio that it was finished. Some of them later joined the resistance from inside the Vichy administration and risked everything quietly. Some of them did not. Some collaborated and were shot in 1945 in the courtyards of small towns. The colonel, the man who loved the army the way some men love a cathedral, shot himself in his office on the 2nd of July, 1940. The verger of his parish church told me 20 years later that he had left a letter saying only, "I am sorry. I do not know how to be a soldier in this France." The captain with the scar on his lip, I never learned his name. I hope he survived the war. I think he did. The lieutenant from Toulouse and I made our way through the Lot, through the Cévennes into the Massif Central. We slept in barns. We carried no weapons. We were not yet anything that had a name. The word maquis would not be applied to men like us until 1942, when the service du travail obligatoire pushed thousands of young Frenchmen into the hills to avoid forced labor in Germany. But the seed of it, the refusal that walks out of an office and into a field at 4 o'clock in the morning, that seed was planted in June of 1940 by men who were never thanked for it. We made contact over the next year with what would become the Combat Network, and through them with London, and through London with the strange, improbable broadcasts of a tall officer in exile whom most of France had never heard of. His name was de Gaulle. He had spoken on the BBC on the 18th of June. We had not heard him live. We did not need to. When the liberation came in 1944, the photographs were of de Gaulle on the Champs-Élysées, and of the Free French divisions, and of the FFI fighters with their tricolour armbands. Good. They earned their photographs. But the men who walked out of barracks in June of 1940, most of them never had a photograph. Most of them are not in the official histories. The records spike around the great names and skip the kitchen door at 4 o'clock in the morning. That is how official records work. That is what archives are for and why men like me, 50 years on, still talk. If forgotten refusals are your kind of footnote, the next dispatch from the shadows is already on its way.